Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can see me. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Michelle Boardman, and I'm the Director of Social Marketing for the TA Network. And if you've joined one of our webinars before, you'll know that this is new, being able to see me. We've now engaged our video functionality because we wanted to let you know that we're here at the other end of the line, looking forward to engaging with you around today's content. This webinar is a part of a series of monthly webinars held by the Social Marketing Learning Community within the TA Network. And the Learning Community is hosted by Michael Collado, the Communications Coordinator at Youth Move, and I. And we try to gear our topics around things that are of interest to you in social marketing. And so we welcome your input at any time during this webinar. You can put a comment in the chat box letting us know what you'd like to see covered in future webinars. Today's webinar is the fourth in a series done by Frameworks Institute with us around developing messages on children's mental health. And if you haven't seen the other webinars, no worries. Our speaker today will go over a few basics around framing messages, and then we'll dive right into new content for today. And today's topic is really exciting because she's focusing on systems of care. How do you explain this rather complex model of systems of care to a broad audience, to youth, to families, to practitioners, and to all of the people who work in our field? So this promises to be an exciting topic. And today's speaker is Jen Nichols, who's the Assistant Director of Research and Audience Engagement for Frameworks. You won't be able to see her during today's webinar because Jen is over in DC in her office. But I will be working with her on the chat because there will be several points during the webinar where she'll be looking for our feedback. And although she can't see the chat screen and we won't be able to see her, you'll be able to hear her. And I'll help her let her know when your comments appear. If you like what you hear today and you want to engage more deeply with framing and the tools that the Frameworks Institute puts out, the TA Network is offering a great opportunity for free social marketing through an online portal called the Frameworks Academy. And you can let us know in the chat box here or reach out to me after this webinar, and we'll connect you so that you can use the tools within the Frameworks Academy, which are free. You'll have access to them for a year to impact your social marketing and develop strong messages within your own community. So with that, I will turn today's webinar over to Jen. Please use the chat box and stay engaged with us because we'd love to hear your comments and ideas, and I hope that you enjoy today's presentation. I'll return momentarily, or at the end actually, to ask for your help with the survey and to wrap us up and let you know what next month's webinar will be all about. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, this is Jen Nichols. I want to say thank you so much for giving us your time today and joining us for this fourth webinar in the series. It is a beautiful day in DC. I don't know what the weather's like where you are, but nothing says beautiful weather like staying inside and looking at your computer screen for 90 minutes. So I really, really appreciate your time and hope we can make this a productive use of it this afternoon. So I'll walk you through where we've been just a little bit when towards the end of the webinar we'll kind of go through everything we've covered in all four of the series. And I think they're recorded, so as Michelle was saying, if you're just joining us for the first time, no worries. I think you'll still get something out of this, and I'm looking forward to hearing your input and feedback as well. So this webinar is hosted by the Frameworks Institute and the National TA Network through the University of Maryland, and we're glad you're here. And the learning community, as you know, is learning to use a framing approach to social marketing. So we're here to share strategies with you that have been tested through Frameworks' extensive research process to help you shape your communications in ways that will translate some of the complicated things you work on and complex ideas that you traffic in every day for all the people you work with. here's our agenda for today. We'll take a look at the framing tools that my colleague Jess Moyer and our research friend Rose Hendrick shared with you in the last webinar, Webinar 3. We'll ask you, if you were part of Webinar 3, to share with us any framing challenges you've encountered, any opportunities you've taken advantage of since the last time we met last month, and invite you to let us know how your framing efforts are going. And then we're going to talk about how to frame well-being and the importance of direct services for folks, and then move on to talking about systems of care and how you can make systems of care easier to imagine for people who don't think about those kinds of things or who have never heard the term system of care before. And then we'll do some question and answer and a little bit of a framing, like a framing quiz to round out the webinar. We'll see how much you remember from the last 4. All right, so let's start with some highlights from Webinar 3. In the last webinar, we really focused on talking about the difference between telling an individual story, so a story about a person, the kind of, vulnerable child story, or the hero story of someone who rose from difficult circumstances or triumphed over a real obstacle or challenge. Moving away from that and towards stories that help people think about communities, systems, structures that influence how individuals' outcomes are shaped. So, in other words, moving away from an individual story that can lead people to remember their biases when they're thinking about why some individuals do better than others, and instead really pull forward the context in which people live their lives to help people think about more expansively and more productively the ways in which we can shape environments for children so that they're more likely and better able to reach good outcomes because we've put them into conditions and contexts and situations that allow them to achieve their fullest potential. And to do that, Jess focused on 2 metaphors in particular. The first comes from our work on adolescent substance use and prevention. And she shared with everyone a boiling over metaphor, the idea that we can create environments that turn down the temperature for adolescents in order to prevent early substance use entirely or keep it from boiling over into a more serious problem. So the metaphor of boiling over is a way of helping people think about context. Pots don't boil if the stove isn't turned on, if the heat is low enough to keep that from happening. And in the same way, adolescents are less likely to use substances, to experiment with them, to experience problems with substance use if they're surrounded by environments and communities and policies that make it more difficult for them to access substances in the first place. And then the second metaphor that she shared with us was resilience scale, which is about, it's a metaphor designed to help you explain, again, the ways in which we can influence children's outcomes by the contextual circumstances that we build for them. So we can load positive things onto a child's resilience scale, onto their developmental scale, and tip the scale positively towards positive outcomes, or we can offload negative items. So we can, offload bad schools by building better schools. We can add on positive mental health through adding on programs that screen for problems and provide early interventions and so on. So how we weight the scale in children's favor for positive developmental outcomes can be thought of metaphorically, and it's a powerful way to help people see how it's not only parents whose responsibility it is to make sure kids have good outcomes, but there are a lot of things that we can do in our environments to make sure that happens. This is an interesting metaphor, I think, because it also allows you to talk about the relationship of gene interaction or gene and environment interaction. So in using the metaphor of the scale, you can talk about the fulcrum as our genetic makeup And when we're born, our fulcrums may all be in different places because our genetic composition might all be different. But over time, as interactions with the environment occur, we can move the fulcrum point on that scale as genes interact with the environments around us, and that influences how genes express themselves. We actually have the ability to move children's fulcrums on this developmental scale so that it makes it harder to tip the scale negative even when children encounter adverse circumstances if we've done the work ahead of time to create environments that can support a repositioning of the fulcrum into a space that makes it harder for genes to express themselves negatively later in life in response to negative or adverse circumstances. And then just rounded out the webinar with a framing challenge to you, which is to reframe a story that you've written previously or recently come across to include more of the important context, to pull away from that individual story and to really focus on telling a story about environments and the social conditions that set the stage for healthy development. So did anyone, this is my question to all of you on the webinar today, did any of you take her up on the challenge? And if so, could you tell us a little bit more about your success or challenge in using either metaphor in the past month since we last met in May? You can put your answers in the chat box, and I'm going to give you just a moment to fill in that chat box. Michelle, let me know what pops up. Who's got something to share?
I certainly will, Jen.
Hi there, Miss Unicorn. And if you haven't used one of the metaphors, let me ask, is there a reason that you didn't use them? In other words,
no one is offering up a suggestion at this point.
Okay. Well, I'll give you some time to think about that. If you care to share some aspect of framing that you've tried to use, whether it's these metaphors or something from one of the prior webinars, let us know. We'd love to hear from you and know how it's going. So with that, I want to move into some of the new materials that we have for today, talking about well-being and how to frame systems of care. Now, if you've been with us the last few webinars, and you know that one of the places we start our work is in the realm of culture and figuring out exactly where it is people are coming from when they're thinking about any particular social issue. So what are their dominant assumptions or perceptions or misperceptions of an issue that guide their thinking about that issue? We do this so that we can identify what kinds of framing challenges we have, or what are the things that are getting in the way of our ability to communicate about an issue to the public and have the public interpret our message in the way that we want it interpreted. So in thinking about well-being and support services, the public holds some dominant assumptions, and I want to walk through a few of those with you. So this comes from our cultural models research. It's not exhaustive, but these are key ideas that we heard over and over and over again when we interviewed members of the public across the country to get a sense of how they think about those issues. So first and foremost, when we asked people to define well-being, again and again, they came back to the idea that well-being is about good financial and health decision-making. So it's about making good decisions about money and good decisions about your health. And so what that does is really place the onus for achieving well-being on individuals. There's really no strong sense among members of the public who don't work in this field about the ways in which well-being can be promoted through policy, through programs, through community and collective action. That makes it hard if you're a communicator trying to talk with people about well-being, to talk about how programs or policies can actually promote well-being, because people are really stuck on the idea that it's entirely up to the individual to experience well-being. When we talked with folks about direct services or human services, what we found over and over and over again is that when people think about human services or any kind of direct services, they see it as kindness and charity. So they really get stuck on the idea that supportive services are a handout for people who haven't succeeded in life and haven't succeeded in getting the resources they need on their own. So because their overwhelming default is to things like food banks, they really think about this as kindness and charity. And if you're messaging about direct services and providing, for example, publicly funded early learning for children, or so like a program like Head Start, or you're talking about multi-generational approaches to poverty, or you're talking about open access mental health clinics for early interventions for children's mental health. Those, if you're talking about the need for those kinds of things, it's hard for people to reason with you about the need for those sorts of things long term when they're hung up on the idea that any kind of program like that is really about charity instead of about filling an important public health need, for example, in the community. There's a strong feeling among the public that well-being is about remediation. So, oh, we've identified a problem and now we have to fix it. And that support services are about fixing problems too. So the public has a really hard time thinking about prevention and how preventing problems is actually an enormous part of the work of building people's well-being, that identifying early on through screening potential problems in children's mental health, for example, in order to steer them on a different course before problems worsen and become something that can be harder to fix. It's just not on the public's radar. When we talk about people who seek out supportive services, people turn to an assumption that the folks who need these services come from a place of poverty or experiencing poverty. And when people reason about low-income communities, they tend to conclude that poverty is caused by deficits that are passed from one generation of family to the next. And those deficits might be cultural. So people rationalize the existence of poverty as a source of as a result of not valuing education, for example. So a lot of biases and pre-existing assumptions come into play when you're talking about supportive services and who needs them and why they need them. Related to the idea that folks tend to assume supportive services are a kind of charity, there's an assumption that because it's a kind of charity that's delivered to people who have temporarily stumbled or haven't been able to get on their feet, or choose your metaphor, that they should be basic and temporary only, and that they should be cut off after a certain amount of time, which of course is not how supportive services work, and suggests that if you're communicating about these issues, you're going to have a hard time, for example, helping people understand the need to fund programs for the long term and not just on a case-by-case basis or an annual basis. And then finally, when we ask people to talk with us about well-being and support services and what the solutions are to promoting well-being and improving the well-being of a community or of families, people tend to point to solutions as being about better choices or relying on informal support networks. And that is partly driven by their assumption, remember, that well-being is about individual choice and it's entirely up to individuals. So there's nothing we can do at a community level to influence people's outcomes or to shore up their well-being. So if everything is about the individual, then the solution that you're left with, or the one that seems most relevant, is that individual has to make better choices or just rely on informal networks like family to help them through, instead of structures that are put in place to make sure everybody has access to the things they need to enjoy good health and well-being. So I'll just say one last thing about this here. All of these dominant models really get in the way of your being able to communicate easily with the public because they're reasoning about everything you say from these kinds of presumptions. And so they're not hearing you in quite the way that you need them to. So I want to talk with you about how we can translate some of the core principles of well-being and systems of care into language that the public can more readily work with and think through. Okay, so while we know that it's important to tell a story, we really need to be asking ourselves, what will that story do? Because some stories have a less productive effect than we think they will, because what they're doing is toggling up in people's minds some of those dominant assumptions, and what we want to pull forward are some more helpful ways of thinking about the issue that kind of skirt around or steer around those less productive models I just talked about. So you're thinking about telling a well-framed story, you need to answer some of the public's key questions. So think about it this way. Everyone on this webinar, you're working in a space in which you are an expert. You know more than the average person does and about the issues that you work on, and it's easy to forget when you have attained a level of expertise, you're advocating, you're thinking about these things all day long. It's easy to forget just how much you know. You come to take your own knowledge for granted. So while you're kind of working and thinking and talking at level 471 in your issue, the public, for the most part, is still back at level 1, which is, why does this matter? Why should we even care about this? So you need to answer some of their primary basic questions in order to help move their understanding to a little bit closer to yours. See, they may not get to level 471, but if you can get them a few levels farther into the conversation past why does this matter, then you're really improving their ability to think like experts think about a problem, and then to arrive at the same kinds of conclusions that experts and advocates have arrived at about what we should do to fix a particular problem. So the first question you need to answer is, why does this matter? Once you've engaged people by using a value to help them think about like what's at stake in addressing this problem, why should I care, why does this matter to me, then you can move into helping them explain or helping them understand the mechanics of the problem that you're describing or the social issue that you're talking about and what's not working and then how it can be fixed. And after you've explained the problem, then you can get to the solution. If people don't understand the problem, it's hard for them to see why a particular solution is needed. But on the other hand, if you just jump right to the solution without explaining the problem, it's equally difficult for them to understand why you need a solution since they don't understand the problem. So a little bit of a catch-22, but this narrative arc can help you. So let me walk you through the strategies we're going to talk about next. The question, why does this matter? Why does well-being matter? Why do systems of care help? We're going to talk about values, and the value that we've tested for talking about this issue is human potential, the idea of maximizing children's potential. So it's a statement along the lines of, when we maximize all children's potential, we're taking care of our community's most important resource, the health and well-being of our future. So appealing to that value in messages about well-being and promoting children's well-being and talking about the need for systems of care, that value answers that question, why does this matter? Because it's about our future potential. It's about making sure everyone in our community can maximize their own and contribute their talents and skills and engagement to our community. Then I want to share with you a couple of metaphors for translating well-being and systems of care. The first is the idea of constructing a house. So it's a construction metaphor to talk about how well-being gets built. It's not simply a passive process. It's not only up to the individual. It's really like constructing a house. It takes a skilled team, and it takes quality materials to build a structure that's strong enough to weather life's storms. And then the second metaphor I want us to cover today is the metaphor of solid tracks. And that's a metaphor designed to explain systems of care, to help people visualize what a system of care looks like and how it works. Like a well-coordinated railway, a good system of care gets children to the services they need, no matter what station they enter through. So giving people that travel metaphor of the tracks can really help them visualize how a system of care can connect people to different kinds of services and be more efficient and successful. And then finally, after you've explained how a particular issue works, then you can get to the policies. So for example, I've just put in here an example of training a network of school counselors to identify problems and direct families to local services they don't know about, giving people some kind of concrete solution something to think about, to visualize what sorts of solutions can address the problem that you've described or the social issue you've discussed is really critical. Because remember, most people just don't know what you know. So if you can share with them something concrete and tangible that they can use as an example or hold on to as an example, you're going to really help them build their understanding of what it is you're talking about. So stay away from abstract solutions. Really give people something concrete to remember and think about. Okay, so let's start with this idea of maximizing children's potential. Here's the human potential value. When we support well-being, we make sure that everyone can reach their potential and fully contribute to our communities. That's the concept. You can write it out or speak it in many different ways. These framing tools are designed to be really malleable, so you can use them creatively and adapt them to your communications needs as you need. The potential value works really well to move people away from the idea that well-being is all about personal choice and that well-being is about physical health and financial success, but also it moves people away from the idea that this is about charity. Because it's not about charity, it's about making sure our communities are as healthy as they can be, because we all benefit when our communities are as healthy as they can be. So this value helps you really push forward that idea of community and policies and programs and systems and structures, the kinds of things that we can all affect through our work to make children more likely to experience good outcomes. So it helps people think about the collective benefits of supportive services. It expands their definition of well-being, so potential is much more than simply health and financial success. It's about where you are in your community, and do you have a community and network? Are you able to enjoy a healthy environment? So that all kind, have you had access to the things that allow you to thrive in school, so that you can fully develop your skills and talents and so on. And it also points people to the idea of what we lose if we don't act now. If we don't act now to make sure that kids turn out well, what will our future communities look like? And it invites people to engage in that way, that this is about long-term planning for our collective improvement. Helping people reach their potential also allows you to, it's a reason to focus on prevention and promotive factors, not just remediation. So you're sparking something that's already innate in children, helping them achieve that and letting it blossom and so on. So it's a different way of engaging people than talking about remediation or prevention. Here's an example from a real advocacy communication. On the green side of the screen, what you'll see is an advocacy message that we were asked to reframe by one of our partners. So I'll give you just a moment to read that. So one of the things that I see here is a lot of crisis, negativity, reminders of people's dominant assumptions about who needs direct services, vital services. So look at this language. Lawmakers are wrestling with the budget. So now it's become this sort of like wild, unruly thing. Vital services are at risk of being gutted. Okay, so that's very fatalistic. They shut the door to critical services for hundreds of thousands of families. Hundreds of thousands of families is a big number. How can we possibly do anything to address the needs of hundreds of thousands of families? So it's really feeding people a sense of fatalism about our ability to do anything, to solve any social problems. Families in need are not going away. So that feeds into people's assumptions that supportive services, vital services, are about answering temporary need, should only be basic because you don't want people to grow dependent on them, and are really charity. Okay, families in need are not going away. And also, if they're not going away, then that suggests that none of the solutions we're fighting for or advocating for work if the plan is that we'll just continue to have families into eternity who have more problems than we can solve. There's a lot of crisis and fatalism happening in here. And then when you get to the bottom, we need a budget that's prudent, reasonable, and doesn't end up costing more than it saves. Again, it's just really framing things in terms of what we lose, and it's a deficit-based communications model. But if you use human potential, you can put the same message in, but you've really flipped it to look at what we gain if we make smart, sensible decisions about our budget. So as we craft a forward-looking budget, so forward-looking budget, implies like, let's think about the future and what kind of future it is we want to build. This is about utilizing our nation's most important asset, our human potential. And then it goes on to take a look at how vital services actually do something for all of us and promote our community well-being. When we support well-being, we recognize that everyone has a valuable role to play, and to do that, we have to maintain and protect initiatives that foster people's capacity to contribute. Okay, so whereas the earlier passage talks about our loss if we cut Head Start to economic productivity, this instead is a much more positive spin on talking about how access to quality learning programs promotes children's well-being by getting them ready for school, and promotes families' stability, economic stability, by helping parents work, because we're making room for people to have children and also have jobs and be able to afford sound, quality care for their young children. A good budget meets our needs today and plans for the future is a much more optimistic sense, has a more optimistic tone than the sentence, we need a budget that's prudent, reasonable, and doesn't end up costing more than it saves. So you can see the difference in tone there. This one is much more positive. It gives people a sense of efficacy. We can do this, and there are real gains to be made if we make smart choices. It's the same message. It's just shifted a bit, kind of tweaked and kind of flipped to take a different tone and really engage people by thinking about how we can solve problems instead of focusing on how big the problems are that we have to solve. You can see that this is important when you're thinking about framing with these values, to think about the many ways you can express the idea of human potential. So here it's expressed in a few different ways. Utilize our nation's most important asset, human potential. That's the only place where I actually use the phrase human potential. Everyone has a valuable role to play. That's, again, getting at the idea that everyone's part of this and has a role, and so we need to maximize their skills and talents. We need to enable them to contribute the things they can contribute to our communities and foster people's capacity to contribute. One more way of saying maximizing human potential. So feel free to use synonyms, turns of phrase, different visuals and images, things that get at the idea of maximizing human potential without having to use the phrase human potential over and over and over again. So you can be creative, and we encourage you to be creative in using these strategies. Now let's turn to a couple of the metaphors. I mentioned the construction metaphor, so let's start there. The idea that it takes a skilled team and quality materials to build children's well-being. And we developed this for the National Human Services Assembly initially. The idea here was to find ways to help people expand their understanding of well-being, to include the kinds of inputs that individuals can't make for themselves. Okay, so how can communities and public agencies and nonprofits support well-being in ways that benefit all of us? I like the construction metaphor because, again, it's very creative. There are lots of different ways that you can use the associations that people have with construction to make your point. Constructing well-being is great because it moves people away from that lack of understanding of what well-being is, and helps them think about direct services as something more than charity. It's actually good construction. Constructing well-being means that well-being isn't either a passive process or something that only individuals engage in on their own. Houses don't build themselves. So in the same way, well-being doesn't just happen. It takes lots of resources to promote well-being in a community. It's just that sometimes we take those resources in some communities for granted and forget or ignore that other communities don't have access to those same resources. So the construction metaphor helps you talk about those kinds of issues, moves people away from the assumption that it's all about the individual and about making good choices. And instead, gives people an opportunity to map what they know about houses onto their understanding of well-being. So I may not understand a lot about well-being. It's not my field. I am not in the health field. But I did read The Three Little Pigs, so I know something about building a strong house, and I know that some materials are better than others, and the quality of the materials matters. For example, I know that construction is a process, so what happens in the earlier phases, like the younger years of a child's life, has consequences for the later phases. And if you don't have a strong foundation, you're going to run into problems later on. But also the well-being requires ongoing work and maintenance. A house doesn't just get built and then people abandon it and don't do anything else to it. If you live in the house, of course, you're always updating it, and houses need repairs and so on. So this is a way that you can use this metaphor to explain why programs are sometimes long-term, or why people may need supportive services over the course of their lifespan, that young children may need those supportive services all throughout their development, that it's about an ongoing process and not just a one-time fix. When you're thinking about something like mental health, this can really help you explain some of that as well. And then structures can be threatened by things like unpredictable weather or spotty construction. So maybe a child is doing well, but all of a sudden something happens in that child's life and they need supportive services. You need those services to be available to the child so they can weather that storm. Or something, gets caught later on in life that wasn't caught in an early screening, but you need services available so that when a problem is identified, an intervention is available and is there for children when they need it. I'm going to play for you a video, a piece of the video from our persistence trial. So this is where a researcher was talking with members of the public, asking them to think and talk with the construction metaphor. I'm going to ask that you turn your computer volume up, or your phone speaker volume up, because we really lucked out on this video and got a lot of very soft-spoken people. So it's a very quiet video, and I have my volume up as high as possible. But if you could turn yours up, then you'll have a better chance of hearing it. What you'll hear is people thinking through the ways in which well-being is constructed. And so they take the metaphor and they start playing with it. And this is a part of our research process where we're asking people how this metaphor can help them think differently about the idea of well-being and what it takes to promote well-being. In the course of this process, what typically happens is that the researcher teaches the metaphor to a couple of people and then leaves the room, and then those people teach the metaphor to a couple more people, and so on. So you'll see a lot of people kind of moving in and out of the video, and these are clips pulled from those trials. So here we go.
Metaphor, right? Comparing well-being to something.
Video and got a lot of very soft-spoken people. So it's a very got a lot of very soft-spoken people. So it's a very got a lot of very soft-spoken people. So it's a I think we've got a technical difficulty.
Okay, so go ahead and pause the video and let's go ahead and start over. And so just hold the phone a little away from the computer speaker, and I'm going to try something on my end. Bear with us just a moment while we get this situated, everyone.
Is it okay to play it here?
Yep, go ahead and try and play it again for us.
Try it.
Well-being is something that has to be built, like and strengthened by certain things. Social relationship, resources, opportunities to thrive. What are the things that people need for well-being?
Support.
Or in terms of like what kind?
Well, emotional, physical, monetary, just and from all different resources.
So, happiness, finance, aka money.
Uh-huh.
We also need self-love.
companionship, a sense of
Yeah.
belonging.
Human services is what influences the build out of the house. Okay, so if we're talking about building walls, we're adding a roof. It could be things like mentoring. Okay, it could be things like job skills, job training.
Education.
Okay,
Many people have some sort of structure already and want to apply these human services to give them the pieces of the material that they're missing to strengthen their structure.
But even like building a house, most people can't go out and just build a house by themselves.
yeah, it's teamwork. You know that weather and other things play a large factor on your house, right? So you have also sorts of external influences
The
also.
unpredictable.
Right. There's luck, destiny, whatever you call it, karma.
You have your straw house.
Yeah.
You're just fine. You have a house. Your house is made of straw, but when the heavy wind comes, you don't make it.
Right. It can be knocked over easily.
Right. And what is, in that case, like, what is the wind metaphorically?
Illness, financial situation, just, I don't know, just someone,
That piece that's lacking.
yeah.
The piece that you haven't built a strong enough foundation for.
You know, if you consider your house to be your well-being, right? Various people are in different states of well-being. People have different types of houses.
We want human services to provide the building blocks to make each and every individual a stronger structure in society.
Okay, so I really like in here the idea of support services being available to help make individuals stronger structures in society, to provide the building blocks for that. There are lots of ways in which the folks listening to these, learning from each other how to use the metaphor, what the metaphor does. They pick up some of the entailments or the associations of the metaphor and run with it. So the idea of weathering life's storms was something that we didn't come up with in our research. It actually came from these persistence trials where people took the metaphor and really just carried it to really useful places and thinking about how what we do for individuals early in life or in times of life when they need it can have consequences later on for their ability to handle adversity. So it's really productive in that way. This advocacy message, this is borrowed from an organization's website that does a variety of work, including working with children, but they have other programs as well. So we help them reframe their About Us page. I'll give you just a moment to read this. So this is one of the most, this was their mission statement. So it was on the front page of their website, so most visible or most seen piece of communication if you were to go to this particular organization's website. And I will leave them anonymous. But what I see here in looking at it is that it's really focused on this idea of individuals. This is about charity, helping America's most vulnerable groups, helping at-risk individuals, and advocating for the most vulnerable among us. So they use vulnerable twice. They use the word at-risk. It's really playing into people's assumptions about who ends up needing supportive services. That is the most vulnerable among us, that these are people who come from families potentially have made bad decisions. It feeds people's dominant assumptions about how people ended up in a position where they need help. And it really doubles down on the assumption that supportive services are charity. So we help them reframe it using the construction metaphor. So take a look at this instead. I'll give you just a moment to read it. So now instead of helping those in need live their productive lives, which sounds more like charity, this is really focused on what are we doing for the community at large? How are we benefiting society at large through the work that we do? Well, we're providing the bricks and mortar of well-being. Here's an example of what those things entail. Social relationships, so people aren't isolated, opportunities to be healthy, providing mental health services. And when these things aren't available, people may have difficulty weathering life's storms. So we provide really important ingredients for well-being or materials for well-being. And life storms can affect anybody. It's not simply the most at-risk among us who needs help sometimes. A layoff can lead to struggles for a family. Death in the family can lead to mental health challenges. A lingering health concern might need ongoing long-term attention in order to help people thrive. Then again, since 1899, we've helped to shore up the foundations of well-being for those in harm's way through advocacy, research, and direct services. So instead of it being at-risk individuals and the most vulnerable, now it's those who find themselves in harm's way. And lots of people, any one of us, could be in harm's way. So it expands the idea of who it is who needs these services and is much more inclusive in thinking about how these services can promote well-being among a very wide population. Again, just as with potential, you can see there are lots of different ways to use this metaphor creatively. So bricks and mortar is a reference to the idea of constructing. Supports for materials, weathering life's storms, foundations of well-being, these are all ways to get at that idea of constructing something together, constructing a strong house, constructing well-being. So with that, I want to give you an opportunity to think about how you might use the construction metaphor in your own communications. And I'm going to ask that in the chat box, you take a moment to just write down associations that you have with the idea of constructing well-being. So what are words or phrases that you could use in your communications to get the idea across that well-being is constructed? So for example, drafting a blueprint might be the way that you talk about creating a work plan or a service and treatment plan for a family or a child. Laying a strong foundation might be how you talk about the need to get services into a child's life early on to make sure that their later development is strong. Building on solid ground would be a way of talking about how you can lay, how interventions can ground children in well-being so that you can build from early progress. So take just a minute or two in the chat box and let's see what kinds of synonyms, related words or phrases you can come up with that we could all use to convey the idea of constructing well-being.
Jen, we've got lots of input here. We've got building a strong foundation, building a plan, building upon a family's strengths, understanding the stages of the project.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah.
Formulating a plan, training to help build a blueprint, provide framing structure.
These are all fantastic. So I haven't actually heard the word construction, which is exactly the point, that you don't have to use that term to get the idea across. But I like how you're using words and phrases that take the idea of building something and then lay it onto the work that you're doing for families and children. So the idea of training to build a plan, the solid foundations, that construction happens in phases. So you might need a treatment plan that exists in stages. Let's get this done, and then we'll move on to this thing here. It's really a tactile, concrete way for people to think about health and mental health and treatment and intervention and prevention. Anything else, Michelle?
Yeah, establishing your roots.
Interesting. Okay, great.
We've got a few more people typing, too.
This is one of my favorite exercises because I studied English and taught writing, so I'm a bit of a writing nerd, and I love this kind of creative brainstorm to think about all the different ways that you can use the metaphor and really make it your own.
Ooh, how about the handiwork and tools it takes to care for a home?
Nice. I love it. The handiwork and tools, so you're kind of expanding out into who is the team responsible for this, and it allows you to also talk then about what kind of training does the team doing the construction need in order to make the project a success. So there's lots and lots of ways that you can use this metaphor creatively to talk about all different aspects of the work that you do.
We've got empowering families with tools.
Yeah, thinking about the tools again.
Building foundations. A home needs regular maintenance.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Okay, well, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on, but if you have more ideas, do share them in the chat box because everyone can see them, and you can boost each other's archive of ideas for how they can everyone can adopt this metaphor into their communications work. So be as creative as you can in the chat box, and feel free to keep contributing so everyone else can see your ideas and share them too. I want to move on to the second metaphor, which is the metaphor of solid tracks. So like a well-coordinated railway, a good system of care gets children to the services they need no matter what station they enter through. So this is an interesting project that we did in Jacksonville, Florida, and we did a lot of work there to test some of the existing strategies we had on talking about early childhood development and children's mental health. And we've covered some of that research in an earlier webinar. I think it was webinar 2 that we covered that, and we'll come back to that in a minute in our refresher. But in particular, Duval County in Florida was building a system of care that really focused on children's mental health and how to tie children's mental health and social emotional learning and schools together. So kind of envisioning a big system of care that brought the schools in with the health, nonprofits and agencies in town, and provided access for children and their families through schools to the kinds of services kids need to develop socially and emotionally well, and to get access to early interventions when that was necessary. So the metaphor that we designed for them and then tested to good effect, we got really good results on this metaphor, was the metaphor of solid tracks. Now, the tracks metaphor came to us. When we're designing a metaphor, we do something that we call the sandbox. So we all play in the metaphor sandbox coming out. So our research team does, my team, which does more of the training side of our house. We all get together in the metaphor sandbox, which sounds a lot more fun than what it actually is, which is a Google Doc. But we get in on this Google Doc and all put in the metaphors that we can think of that we think will respond to the communications challenges we're trying to solve for. And in this instance, we've been doing a lot of work in Jacksonville to think about the system of care. And one of the things we noticed in Jacksonville is that it's famous for its railroad tracks. So there are a lot of railroads that kind of come together in Jacksonville and crisscross, and everywhere you go in the city there are a lot of tracks. And so we thought, well, maybe that's a good metaphor for a system of care. So we tested and it actually worked extraordinarily well. So that became the metaphor that we now recommend for talking about systems of care, but it was born out of our researchers being down in Jacksonville and noticing that there are train tracks everywhere and thinking that could make a really good metaphor. So here we are. And the story you're telling with this metaphor is that just as a safe and reliable railway system depends on having sturdy and well-built tracks, a well-built, connected system of care can support all children as they develop and grow. Okay, so it moves people away from the assumption that it's what we call the family bubble, the assumption that children's outcomes are solely the result of their parents and that only parents have responsibility for children's well-being and for getting kids what they need. Again, the same sort of fatalism or determinism, the idea like, well, bad things happen and there's nothing we can do about it. fatalism, feeling overwhelmed, we can solve problems, and always that assumption that it's up to the individual to overcome adversity on their own. And instead, what we found when we tested this with the public is that it helped people understand how a system of care can work better than standalone services, in which a family has to go knock on 20 doors to get the sorts of services they need. It helped people think about how systems actually work, and that we're capable of designing systems that work more efficiently. So we can increase access to vital services or to important resources by redesigning the system so it works better. It helped people understand how it's necessary to make sure a family who needs any kind of particular resource should be able to access it from any, like, quote-unquote station. So every door that you knock on becomes the right one. Every station you enter will get you where you need to go. And then, of course, it plays on the idea of being on track and helping people see how building a system of care can help keep kids on track to positive health outcomes. So once you're on board, you can keep rolling to your destination. I'm going to play another video. This one is a little louder. We had some somewhat more enthusiastic, vivacious, outdoor voice kind of people in this video. So it should be easier to hear. And I'm going to play this video. It's people on the street thinking and talking about this tracks metaphor and how to use it. So you'll hear them thinking about systems of care and how we can unite like the school system and the healthcare system and the human services system together into one big system that works more efficiently because everything's connected. Here we go.
What are some other things, like things that the city could do to support its children?
To bring the learning system and the recreations and make it all one big system so it all works and functions correctly.
Develop some type of system to start, maintain, and finish.
Having a system, a set of tracks on a solid foundation, if you will, to get kids from point A to point B.
If you imagine a locomotive, you see several different cars, and all the cars are connected, and they are all going in one direction.
Need to unite and become one big track instead of being, a bunch of little railways, being one big track of learning so that we're all on the same page, learning the same things at the same time.
If all of us are going to celebrate and unify behind the success in Northeast Florida, we need to view the problem holistically and how each of us can be a different part of the solution.
We're the hub, and how train tracks are hopefully going to be the connection to make things better.
Yeah, it's connecting Jacksonville with a solid foundation, putting rails on top of it, and starting to move our children around from place to place to place as they grow mentally within our city.
So that, a student can prosper and learn more than, moving from one area to another and then being behind in that other area because this school system was behind in that.
What would it take for Jacksonville to become a hub for children's positive development? What would that take?
People, money, it would take time.
We don't have participation, from home, school, outside. Our kids won't make it.
The tracks here ain't that solid.
Those tracks are missing a lot of the rails.
We realize we're losing our children. We have a lot of young kids that are by themselves, and that this program could actually put them on the right foundation because a lot of children don't have parents who are educated, don't have parents who know what to do or know how to be involved.
We're kind of on the railway of the different things that lead to success.
We put the tracks down, and then we've got all these stops along the way that get them to their final destination.
Educators, health personnel should be at each stop to, guide them on, all right, you're fine here. Now, which way do you want to go? Based on how they grow up, their development as a child is going to depend on what type of adult they're going to be, whether it's going to be a productive adult or a non-productive adult.
I believe that programs like this can really get Jacksonville on the right track.
I would get on board. I would jump on board. Whatever we can do to support the kids in this city.
Because we don't want to derail, and we want to make it to our destination.
Okay, the woman in the green shirt, I feel like I would like to go see her as an inspirational speaker because she's just so enthusiastic. Video just every time makes me laugh because she's just so right with us on the tracks metaphor. I appreciate that one. But you can hear people thinking and talking about how you can use the tracks system or the tracks metaphor to think about systems, and that you wouldn't want a railway system that where the trains weren't connected, where where you had to go, way out of your way to get to your destination because there wasn't a track built there that would get you there. And being able to visualize in a really concrete way what a system of care looks like helps people then think about, oh yeah, I guess we need to make sure that educators and healthcare professionals and families are all working together to make sure kids get where they need to go. But that's an abstract concept, and the tracks metaphor really does help people visualize it, and when people can visualize it, it makes it easier for them to think through and also to remember, so that the next time you have a conversation with them about a system of care, that visual that they have in their heads already from exposure to the metaphor can pop back up and guide their thinking more productively than if you're asking them to think from a very abstract place. Here's an example of a typical tweet that might be about system of care, county budget cuts hurting the system of care. So let's see what this would look like if it were reframed with construction. Here we've just got county budget cuts may hurt the system of care some families rely on to get access to services they need. Show your support for families. So this is a little crisis-y, but also focusing on some families, doesn't define what the system of care is. So if you don't know what that means, then you won't understand why the county budget cuts are so important, especially if they're only affecting some families who are reliant on services that you may not be reliant on. So there's a lot in here that's not explained well for the average member of the public, but construction can help us with some of that, or sorry, tracks can help us with some of that. So let's see what this looks like framed with tracks. Our system of care is like a high-speed railway system for children's health. Budget cuts will tear up tracks and leave our kids stranded. Tell the council to #GetOnBoardForKids at this link. Okay, so notice that the first thing it does is start with the metaphor. Our system of care is like a high-speed railway system for children's health. Okay, so start with the metaphor because that's the visual, tactile thing people can attach to. So by mentioning that first, you call that image up into their minds, and so they're thinking through the metaphor with whatever comes next. So then you get to the budget cuts, which will tear up tracks and leave our kids stranded. It's a very visual way of talking about what effect budget cuts will do. Notice that it's not some families anymore. It's children's health and our kids get on board for kids. Okay, so it's more collectivizing and inclusive. It's not isolating some people into a group that needs services. Rather, instead, it's really opening up to, this is about our community doing well. Okay, so let's work with this a little bit. Imagine that a podcast host asks you to explain your efforts to build a system of care, and the podcast host asks you, aren't these services available if a family is motivated enough to find them? So, why do we have to spend all this time building a system of care? If a family needs something, shouldn't they just be able to, shouldn't it be on them to go get those services? How could you use the tracks metaphor to respond to this question? So it might be a podcast host, it might be a policymaker you're talking with, it might be a member of the public, it might be your Aunt Joan at Thanksgiving dinner who doesn't understand what you do. So, I mean, regardless of who that person is, how could you use the tracks metaphor to formulate a response to this question? Notice that the question is really assuming, again, that families are responsible for themselves, and that well-being is about families making good decisions, and that there's no role for community investment here or for social policy or public programs or supportive services that can help families. So take time in the chat box. I'll give you just a minute here to think about how you might use tracks to respond, and you can put a sentence in there or some phrases you might use. Go ahead and think through that, and let's see what we get. Michelle, how's that chat box looking?
Jen, we've got lots of folks typing, so we're going to give them a minute to think this through.
Okay, great.
Okay, they're starting to come in. So we have some feedback. There is only one station stop in a system of care. Not the most elegant, but maybe something about building the track or pathway between service providers so that there is no wrong door. We want a train schedule that keeps trains moving in the direction they should without collision, just as we want programs to work together instead of against each other.
That's great.
There are many pathways to services. By building a system of care, these pathways become easier to navigate.
These are all excellent examples. Keep going. Is there more?
Okay. Every train needs a conductor to direct it where to go. If the train has no direction, it could run off the tracks.
Terrific. These are excellent examples. I appreciate the idea that a system of care can have a hub, so you enter through one station and it gets you to all the places you need to go. The idea of avoiding collision is a good way to talk about, like, let's not be redundant in our efforts. A system of care, it reduces waste, it reduces the chance of redundancy, of duplicating efforts, and it makes sure that one intervention isn't interfering with another intervention and actually counteracting it. So there are lots of different entailments here. All of those are excellent examples.
And we've got one more. A family should be able to get off at station B and get connected to the services at station H.
Yeah, I love it. These are really creative ways to use the metaphor. I'm thrilled with the efforts, everyone. Thanks so much for participating in that, because I think in sharing your thoughts on this, you're helping everybody else on the webinar actually think through how they might apply it as well. So this kind of creativity is exactly the sort of work that goes into taking a framing strategy that I can share with you and then really making it your own and making it work for the specific things within the idea of a system of care that you need to be able to explain to people. This is terrific. Here's one possible example that I came up with as a response. So you can see here, I've used the idea of destinations. So supportive services are a series of destinations, places families need to get to help their children thrive. So maybe they need to get to mental health services and academic support or specialists and an early learning program. The system of care we are building is like a network of railway tracks that connects all of these destinations. So we're making it possible for families to get where they need to go no matter which station they enter the system through. The system of care is efficient, better coordinated, and designed to keep the trains running on time and regularly. And then just, I couldn't help myself at the very end, so all kids have the opportunity to maximize their potential. So I snuck a little value in at the end too. So you can see lots, just as you're putting into the chat box, there are lots of different ways in here too to get across the idea of tracks and a railway system and how a system of care functions like that. Excellent. Okay, and then finally, once we've explained the problem or the issue and the mechanics of it and how it works, we can get to solutions. So I'd offered you this solution earlier, but the real important thing here is to name and explain concrete solutions or bigger principles that you want your audience to support. Like, let them know it's not just a big problem. There are also big solutions that can help address the problem. So some things to keep in mind when you're thinking about solutions in your messaging. make them as concrete as you can. Concrete things are easier to remember than abstract things, so be specific. Make them collective. Because we know that the public is really, really invested in thinking about individual responsibility, it's harder for people who are not part of your field to think about systemic solutions or shared solutions. So really boost people's ability to think about the collective by offering collective solutions. Always show the process, like help people understand how the solution that you're offering is actually going to solve the problem and how it's matched well to the problem or to the issue. Your solution should be feasible. So because we know that members of the public tend to feel very fatalistically about our ability to solve big problems, it's important to share solutions that can actually work, that seem doable or manageable, to feed people's optimism that we can actually do something about the problem or the issue. And then finally, to be disinterested. So credible solutions to the public are those that, for example, don't suggest that you have a financial stake in the outcome or that you're particularly partisan. Okay, so putting it all together, again, this is the sort of formula for a well-framed story that you can use as a kind of a good tool when you're framing to think about. Have you talked to people about why this matters? Use the value to do that. Once you've done that, once you've engaged them, then you can answer these questions. How does it work? If it's not working, why not? With metaphors, explanation, concrete examples. And then finally, once people have a good working understanding of the issue itself and how it works, then you can get to how we're going to solve it or address the challenge. And that's where concrete solutions come in, a call to action, making people feel a sense of efficacy, like, yes, we can really do something about this, and what the core principles are you want them to understand. Okay, so let's wrap up by looking at the whole of the webinars that we've done here. So webinars 1 through 3, we'll just kind of look through everything that we're 1 through 4, I guess now, all the things that we've covered in this. Way back when we started this, we shared with you a few traps to avoid. The first is to remember not to directly correct misperceptions. It's a framing trap, because you'll end up just reinforcing people's misperceptions if you say, this isn't true, instead this is what's true. You've just reminded people of what they already believe to be true, and so a good rule of thumb is if you don't believe it, don't repeat it. Data is not your frame. It's very tempting when you're an expert and an advocate in an issue area to take all the data you collect, and I know all of you work with a lot of data, to tell it what you think is a compelling story through numbers, but numbers, contrary to our beliefs, do not speak for themselves. So if your story is all about the numbers, then you need a new story. And even though it's really tempting to get people to pay attention to your issue by yelling crisis, that focus on urgency without a way of balancing it with big solutions doesn't move people to think differently about an issue or engage them. Instead, it causes people to kind of hide their heads in the sand. So avoid crisis framing. Even though it's a popular strategy, it's not an effective one. So once we covered those, we talked about some values. So one value that we talked about 2 webinars ago was the value of ingenuity. And this was really about, this is the value that we tested for talking about children's mental health. So how can we promote children's mental health? We've got resourceful solutions to do that. And then we've just covered the human potential value today, helping children maximize their potential so our communities can benefit. And then in the course of our webinar series, we've covered 5 metaphors that all do something a little different. So levelness was the metaphor for talking about children's mental health. It's like a table, and if children aren't level, if their mental health isn't level, then they can't function in daily life. There's the boiling over metaphor for adolescent substance use, which we talked about earlier in today's webinar, and the resilience scale metaphor for talking about children's development and how environments can influence genetic expression. So we talked about that earlier today too. That was from webinar 3. And then we've just covered 2 more, the solid tracks metaphor for talking about systems of care, and the construction metaphor for explaining well-being and helping people take a more expansive definition of what well-being is, that it's not just financial and physical health, it's much broader than that. Okay, so Framer's Gonna Frame, my favorite part of today's webinar, other than the creative brainstorm, which is where we're going to go through some communication scenarios, and I'm going to ask you to use your chat box to make a decision about how you would respond to each of these scenarios. So there are a few multiple choice, and then we get to some open-ended questions. Here's the first one. I have to explain why putting promotive factors in place is just as important to young children's development as early interventions. My best framing strategy is to A, share the data, B, appeal to ingenuity to get people thinking about solutions, or C, use the resilience scale to explain aspects of development.
Okay, Jen, people are ready to respond. We've got a couple C's. Use the resilience scale.
Excellent.
That's like a lot of people are agreeing.
That's the strategy I would do too. I would choose C. I don't think you would go wrong if you appeal to ingenuity, but if you really want to explain, so values are good to engage, but to explain, you really want to go to those metaphors. So resilience scale is the perfect answer. I have to give a talk on adolescent suicide prevention. My best framing strategy is to tell a story about new intervention strategies that show promise and illustrate how they work, or to tell a story about a young person's death that could have been avoided if someone had recognized the signs.
And we've got people responding with A.
Absolutely. Okay, you guys get an A+. This is absolutely right. You want to avoid those really crisis-ridden stories about vulnerable individuals that are about blaming and shaming. Instead, you want to focus on what the solutions are and explain how they work and tell a collective or system story. There's another one. I have to advocate for a policy banning liquor sales at any stores within 1,500 feet of a school. What's my best framing strategy? To A, use the solid tracks metaphor, or B, use the boiling over metaphor?
And people are responding with B.
Yes, absolutely. So I would turn to the metaphor that we designed for talking about preventing adolescent substance use by creating environmental conditions that make it less likely that young people will engage in substance use. Absolutely. Here's one more. A colleague shares a draft of a blog post that tells a story about a vulnerable child to illustrate the need to increase support for home visits. So this is your colleague's written a blog post, and I say your framing is A, great, my job is done here, or B, in need of some work.
People are saying B, needs a little work.
Yeah, I think that's right. It needs a little bit of work. It's really, again, telling that vulnerable child story that doesn't engage people who are, with a story like that will reinforce for folks that it's the parent's fault, and we don't have any responsibility because the parents share all the responsibility here. So a different strategy could help your colleague make that blog post more effective. Oh, I forgot I had this little thing in here, why, and I just explained that for you. So yes, we want to move away from those vulnerable child stories and offer our colleague a little more feedback. Okay, so here are a few open-ended questions. Which framing strategies would you use for each communication situation? So think about each one of these in turn, and what framing strategies would you turn to? For example, if you had to write a letter in response to a local news article about adolescent substance use that emphasizes adolescents' tendency to make poor choices. How would you respond to that? You don't have to write the response, but what framing strategy would you use? Is there a metaphor you would use or a value you would turn to?
We have people responding with ingenuity, boiling over or levelness.
Great.
A couple more boiling over.
Great. Yeah, I would go with boiling over. I think you could use Ingenuity if you wanted to talk about mental health more broadly and how we can be resourceful in our responses to mental health, so behavioral health, and preventing negative behavioral health consequences for young people. I think you can make a good case for using Ingenuity too. What about this one? Mental Health Awareness Month is coming up, and you need to design a poster and pamphlets for local libraries and rec centers to share. So what might you use in that poster or the pamphlets to talk about mental health awareness?
Ooh, we have construction, ingenuity, resilience scale.
Those are all really interesting choices. So Ingenuity for the value, absolutely. I think you can make a very good case for using construction to talk about promoting well-being more broadly, and mental health is a big part of well-being. I think you can make that case. And resilience scale too. You can talk about how we can promote positive mental health development, positive outcomes for children by offloading negative factors from their scale that can contribute to poor mental health. One thing I haven't heard is levelness. That's the metaphor that was specifically developed to explain children's mental health. The other metaphors you've mentioned position mental health within a bigger picture of child well-being, and I think that's okay too. It really just depends on what your goals are and your communication. But don't forget that levelness exists. It's out there, and you can use that if you need to talk exactly, focus specifically on what children's mental health is and explain that to folks. Here's one. Your state is considering a new voluntary rating certification program for early learning centers, and you want to tweet your support.
We have a few folks suggesting construction, solid tracks, construction metaphor, another solid track.
I think you could do either one of those. If you're thinking about it, because you're coming from the place of your work, and I think this is a way to talk about early learning centers as a valuable piece of a system of care that you can construct. And also you can talk about construction, early learning centers being part of building children's well-being, helping them with their social emotional development and so on if they're high quality and have well-trained staff. So that's great. In the interest of time, I'm going to move past a couple more that I had here. I love my builds, as you can see on my slides here. To share with you in closing a quote that I really like, because I think that it gets at the heart of what framing is trying to do. And it's from President Kennedy many, many years ago. The great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. And I think that's where we often land when we're thinking about communications, is that we're up against people's deep assumptions about how the world works, which come to them through all the stories that we tell ourselves through our movies and film and literature and news cycle and so on, that can really embed in us some deep misunderstandings about big social issues. And as advocates and communicators, we have an opportunity to reach more people by helping them move past those persistent but unrealistic ways of thinking about an issue and get to a better, more productive, more accurate understanding of issues. And the framing strategies we've shared in the course of this webinar can really help us do that. So you're up against culture, and that can be difficult, but I hope that the framing strategies that you are armed with now can really help you employ new communications practices that build your audience's understanding of the issues that you work on. And with that, I want to say thank you very much. I want to turn it back to Michelle for our last couple of minutes to talk a little bit more about technical assistance and the feedback forms. Thank you again for your time today.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jen. That was wonderful. It gave me a lot to think about, and I hope it gave all of you a lot to think about as well. So this is the fourth and final webinar in our series with frameworks. All of them will be posted on YouTube and on our website. The slides from today's presentation are below, and you're welcome to download them. We will also send you a note with the transcript and the live video, although it won't be live anymore, but the video so that you can watch it and share it. And you have my email address here. I hope that you'll contact me if you're interested in the Frameworks Academy. And stay tuned, because next month we're working on a webinar that's about search engine optimization. And this webinar, these series of webinars have been about crafting messages. The next webinar is going to be all about how you ensure that your content reaches your audience. Search engine optimization is the most valuable tool in a social marketer's toolkit today. And if you don't know much about it, this will be a great introduction and how you can work with SEO on little to no budget. So this promises to be a good one, and we'll have a great guest speaker for you. Now there's a quick survey that's going to pop up. It's a great place for you to suggest a webinar topic, and we will stay in touch. We look forward to speaking with you again next month. As always, email me if you have any questions. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.